Chapter 3, the escalation on the frontier war, with some minor shifts compared to other chapters that have preceded it and come afterwards, but some really important aspects of the changing nature of this region.
There's quite a lot going on. It's not as dense in one single event as we might have had in some of the other chapters. A lot of information is packed in, as we mentioned in our introduction, the book being laid out with notes. On this date, by the way, this guy came to the frontier. Oh, and on this date, this small town was established. On this date, a small thing happens. And they're none of them by themselves are massive, earth-shattering events, but through the accumulation of them, all the development of certain characters, what their interests are, what they're interested in becoming and doing, and where they're going to go, all those types of things. And you start to see the sharpening and the maturing of certain characters, notably Simon Kenton, as he becomes more and more proficient in the wild as a woodsman, as a hunter, as a defender. All these things he is assimilating more and more into his environment and really becoming one with it and owning the terrain rather than just subsisting and surviving and trying to figure things out.
He's becoming, just like he was in the last chapter, through some pivotal actions and being a messenger, running for the army, he's becoming more and more valuable. He becomes a critical player in the establishment of the organized militia front, meaning that they have multiple compounds, they're developing different forts because they quickly realize that they have to protect themselves, and they need a network of people who can run and also hunt game, provide food for the fort. They need to establish a beachhead that's near wild game that hunters, trappers, and traders, they can bring those resources in for the people while they are starting to cultivate the land. They have to first build their homes, and then they can start having more animals, and they can start developing a lot more. And they're going to find that that's difficult almost right away because they are going to be under siege. The Indians are finally going to find something to unite over, which is to attack the settlers. But they're not going to be successful because the settlers make a very quick pivot into what we would call a fortress, into organization. And that's something that we can see going back really far in Western culture. One of the examples that we were thinking of was King Alfred. He was on the run in marshlands and swamplands after having their main cities vandalized. And he quickly realized that in order to defeat the Danes, they had to become a militia, essentially do guerrilla warfare tactics. And then once he retook some land, then he established forts with specific parameters. How much food could be grown in that region? Was there enough not to have too many more people than that could be provided for it, so that the people could quickly go into the fort to be protected? And they would be able to wait until they could get reinforcement from another fort. And the way that he built his townships and their forts was a precursor to the medieval castles that would come later. They did that in a way that they could be close enough to another one where people could then fall back to that if they needed to. He actually had to build something a lot less complex than a huge fortified castle in order to ward off the Danes. Alfred ended up retaking his country and subduing the Danes. That's because of this strategy. We also see this strategy employed in lots of other times throughout history, even going back into the Bible. If we go back to the book of Joshua and them conquering the land and having to deal with fortresses. So this is a very ancient tactic, but what's interesting is that the Indians have not employed it. They're not organized. They just have small camps that are established all over the place, and they're not used to having to fight anyone but each other and being raided by each other. They're not used to superior technology, and so they're going to quickly find that that's a problem for them to overcome. Now, three things are happening here in this chapter that we can look at the macro shift, and those three things are individual discovery, demographic shift, and geopolitical conflict. So, on individual discovery, Simon Kenton's expedition reveals these cane lands that they've been searching for. We've talked about this mythic Edenic cane lands area that they had a lot of unsuccessful ventures to try to find, and now he's actually discovered it. And he finds that they're untouched, and it's an incredible area to hunt wild game. He's able to quickly procure and safely procure meat for the settlers. And so this leads to the establishment of this region, which is a prized area. So it's immediately going to draw settlers. And Titus, take us into the demographic shift.
Yeah, so with the drawing to a close of Dunmore's War, the frontier appears to be, safer and all that. So we have a lot more people start coming down the Ohio River. That's the typical way that you get down. That's how Simon gets down the river to where he finds the cane lands, with the help of Peter Lorimy, who gave him another set of directions that really helped him suss out which landmark he was missing to find them. And it's a rich place. And with this prosperity of this place, he says that this is going to be a great place for people to settle. And unlike the temptation that some might have, Kenton isn't trying to hoard this for himself and keep it a secret place, kind of like the Indians do. He is interested in bringing people into this area. So he kind of transitions into a guide of sorts, and he, hails river traffic, helps them in, and tells them what they need to watch out for, what they shouldn't do that would attract unwanted Indian attention, what they should do, lots of things like that. So we start getting more and more people coming down the river, and not all of these people are even typical frontier people, hardened woodsmen, or anything like that. A lot of them are people from back east, more of the city slickers, if you will, people who are not used to the hard frontier life, people who have very little knowledge or of bushcraft or any of these type of things. And so he kind of becomes this guide on the frontier, really helping people to do well. And with that, there's myriad different stories throughout this of ones that like it, ones that don't like it and decide to go back, and of course some of the tragedies that happen along the way with people making blunders and running afoul of Indians, the terrain.
So that leads us into the geopolitical conflict, which is the indigenous resistance. And it shifts from these isolated skirmishes into a unified retaliation. And this forces the creation of organized frontier militias under my second favorite character in the book, George Rogers Clark. He's the first leader of the frontier militia. And these guys are going to be crucial to the survival of all of the people coming into this region, this really dangerous region. Here's a visual of the region, the Big Sandy to the Blue Licks. This is the area where they're starting to settle and where they're looking at prized lands. And all the minerals have led to this really rich canelands area. The richness of the area, the fatness of the land, to use a biblical term, is due to the rivers carrying limestone and other minerals to the region. And that's why the Indians prized it so much, but the settlers are wanting to settle on it and then to cultivate nearby it. In order to get to their cultivation stage where they are going to be more prosperous and actually form settlements, townships, villages, they have to first have resources on the land that they can harvest wild game, relying upon the frontiersmen in order to build up their settlement. So that's how you go from a region that is mostly traders and trappers and woodsmen into a region that is full of settlers that then create different trades and crafts based on the needs of the development of the civilization. And Kenton and Tom Williams intercept Peter Lorme at the Big Sandy River, and Lorme expresses surprise that they have not yet pushed into the legendary Canelands. He's like, "Oh, this area that you've been talking about, that we've been looking for, it's there." What are some of the things that stuck out to you, Titus, about the Blue Licks region?
Well, the Blue Licks region is interesting. It's called the Blue Licks because of the bluish hue to the area, but also the large salt deposits that are around there, hence the licks, because the animals really like to come to these areas for all the minerals, for the salt to lick it, just like farmers will put out a mineral or a salt block for their livestock, their cattle, that will lick on it, get the minerals from it. Well, this is a naturally occurring thing here in the Blue Licks. So it's an extremely fertile hunting ground. This is why this area was as prized by the Native Americans as it was, not because they were large agricultural people or farmers, but because of the game. They were primarily hunters. They did grow some crops, but it was much more limited and not nearly as sophisticated as what the white settlers would do. And so they were just looking at the surface on the animals. And they really, really prized this because there's herds of animals that are just walking around. It's not like you have to sit and wait for a single deer to come and then shoot that one deer. There's just herds of them. You can just go pick one, shoot it, pick whichever one you want, those type of things. So it was a very easy hunt as well as plentiful, a prime location for them, even though it wasn't technically the richness of the canelands themselves, which are fueled by the river going downstream, carrying all those minerals and making that really, really fertile soil, as well as great habitat for animals.
And to add some more context to this dynamic of the settlers versus the, we'll call them herdsmen or tribal. This is basically the juxtaposition of civilizations around the world. So I've spent some time in South Africa, and one of the things that a lot of people don't know about South Africa is the primary black tribes that are there now. The Zulus fought and killed off all of the native blacks who were from that region. The Zulus are extremely violent and extremely tribal, and they're also very nomadic. Move and they go off the land in the same way that the Indians in our narrative here are doing. to take a region of land that is rich where the animals can just live off of, and there's also plenty of wild game. That's how they function. They don't have to be organized and orderly. It's whoever's the strongest and can move around to different areas gets to take over that land. When the settlers from Europe came to South Africa, long before they came to America, actually, and we're talking about the Dutch and the English, and they fought each other over this land as well. When they came to the area, they began to cultivate it because it was so rich and so untouched. And there's some of the native tribes that were mistreated by the Boers, so you have some nuance like you do in this story. Some of the natives who do want to do some trading and settling peacefully have been preyed upon by bad characters in this book. And you can read this in the story of David Livingstone and other missionaries. You're going to have this clash because you have a group of people who realize the value and the wealth of the land and are going to take dominion of it like God has had humans do all throughout history, going back to Genesis. This is what really caused a boom, a huge population explosion early on in Genesis because people immediately started cultivating the land and the world had not yet been changed by the flood. When nomadic peoples encounter people who are going to settle the land and going to treat the land differently and cultivate it, there's going to be warfare over that land because the nomadic peoples want to move through and graze it and use it up temporarily, but they still have this sense of entitlement to the land, whereas the settlers want to be there permanently, but they are also, as they grow in population, they're going to expand out. So there's this inevitable clash of civilizations that you continue to find. And you see this in the culmination of the Zulu War. There's the famous movie Zulu, where the British are fighting the Zulus over these lands, over these outposts that they're establishing for settlers on the frontier of South Africa. So the same kind of thing is going on here. Establishing the frontier base camp became critical for survival and for resources. So Kenton, he shoots a doe upon entering the Cane lands, and this critical success signifies to them that they found a location capable of sustaining settlement. And from there, they name the land based on those resources that we talked about, the mineral deposits, and that becomes a lifeline for their permanent camp that's going to be strategically positioned near this abundant and reliable water spring. Wherever there's water, and particularly mineral-rich water, there's going to be lots of life, lots of wildlife. There was obviously plenty of deer, but then also elk, right, Titus?
You mentioned elk, which we don't really have anymore in Ohio. There's rumored to be a couple floating around still, but there's not really any elk in Ohio anymore. We're pretty much down now to deer and other small game, some black bear down near southern Ohio, but compared to what is described here, a thriving metropolis of animal life.
Indians have warded off the bigger predators. So the wolves are not in this region anymore. Smaller predators like coyotes and black bears and mesopredators. That's why the game is flourishing so much. The Indians have already pushed that wildlife. And that's why you have to go towards the area of the country that I'm in, over towards Wyoming and Idaho and Montana, where there's still wide expanses, open space, and refuge for wildlife to find the bigger game, to find elk, to find moose. On this area, we've got mule deer, we've got elk, we've got moose, and then just the further you go up into Canada, the more plentiful it becomes. That's just the changing nature of the world as people move into a region and take dominion of it. It's something we read about in the Bible. The wild animals are too numerous for the Israelites at first. So that's one of the reasons that God gives for having the Israelites slowly conquer the Canaanites, because if they just wiped them all out immediately, then they would be facing too much of the dangerous wildlife that's in the area.
You raise a good point there with that, Cameron, that the abundance of the wildlife is a huge point of contention between the whites and the Indians as the whites begin to move in. Even Kenton noting this, you would see diminishing population, and these animals that at first aren't even really scared of humans because they're not very familiar with humans as a predator, they begin to be more and more wary and a little bit harder to get. No, definitely doable. I mean, we still hunt these animals in this area, so it's not like they were impossible to find, but the easy pickings, so to speak, that the Indians had were no longer that way, and that was a huge bone of contention for them with the white settlers. Big catalyst for not wanting the white settlers there as well.
Animals learn very quickly. They become elusive. I mean, every creature is like this by nature of how God made it. Even fish. One time we were down in La Paz, which is in the Sea of Cortez, so on the other side of Mexico from the Gulf of America. We we were down there doing some spearfishing. We went to this particular sanctuary that was kind of out in the middle of the ocean. It was like this big rock arch that came out, tons of sea lions out there playing with us and stuff. It was just beautiful. So many types of colors of fish. But what was interesting is any of those fish, like parrotfish that would have been really good to eat, the ones that taste good, those ones, when they see you over in other areas, not far from there, they immediately swim away. That's actually how you know a fish tastes good. If they come close to you and they're kind of friendly, then they taste terrible. As soon as you see a fish that darts away and that's afraid of you, that's the type of fish that you need to hunt because they are smart. They know. And then we went to this sanctuary, and those same fish don't give a rip about people. They continue to push west because as more settlers come, there's less game. And a frontiersman like Simon Kenton naturally wants to be where the wild is, where the game is. He wants to continue living this lifestyle. And because that's his skill, he gets pushed further west, going ahead of the population.
Position is to be a hunter, and even as he's in this area with his companion, with Tom Williams. Tom Williams, they build their shelter, and Tom plants corn, and he's content to do more of like the farming and keep their little base camp operating. Then Kenton's like, great, you want to do that? I'm going to just hunt all day then.
Kenton always hated that. He hated that from when he was a kid.
Correct.
In order to keep the land that you've carved out that you want, you have to settle it. So you can't always just be off hunting. Other people will take your land. Other whites will take your land. He could only do so much with land that he wasn't cultivating, taking care of. So he tries to start businesses and establishes little farms, and he ends up having a family later on. But this becomes a huge problem for him because he's not good at keeping the home and the farm. He's always off doing things. He's going to be taken advantage of by other guys. He's actually a really terrible businessman. So this is where knowing your skills, knowing who you are, how God designed you, and then having trustworthy people that you can work alongside is really important. Just like he learned this lesson on who to fall in with, he learned it the hard way early on in the book. He's going to learn the same thing in the business realm later on. He's going to face different types of trials when he gets older. Now, the catalyst to this unchecked encroachment, we could consider this whole area a pressure gauge that's about to blow off some major conflicts. We don't have a huge battle in this chapter, but we're going to get some more here pretty soon. Lord Dunmore, who was the British governor of the region, he was using the militiamen, but also trying to undermine them, and that didn't work out well for him. But because they were successful by relying on the militiamen and still having some of the British regulars there to fight off the Indians, because they won that battle, and that creates this dangerous false sense of security along the frontier. So a bunch of new settlers, there's an influx of them to this area. And that's when we start to get other prominent historical figures that you may or may not have heard of, worth looking up. Guys like James Harrod and Benjamin Logan, they arrive and they stake their claim. And then you have this area called Logan's Camp that's going to develop. They're well known. They're coming with resources and they're coming with money, and they're going to come and claim the land. So Simon's going to start losing some of the land that he had hacked out of the wilderness for himself, because it's not a wilderness for very long. And then this rapid unchecked expansion results in a bunch of shattered treaties. The difference that we start to see here is that when the whites break treaties and have issues with each other, they deal with it with law, with common law elements. And there's some level of what we would call civilization on the law front with the whites, but the Indians aren't like that, not with each other, and certainly not with the whites. Here's where we have the Shawnee Council come together, and they're starting to unite because they realize that they have to have more people in order to ward off the enemy. This deep anger that the Indians have from this grievance, they look at it as rampant theft of their territory, which is more or less true. And so we have two factions here, the moderates and the radicals. And the moderates are going to be represented by Chief Cornstalk, who's a prominent character in the book. And then you have this other group of young warriors. And it's pretty typical. Again, you see this in the Bible. You see this all throughout history. You have the younger warriors. And this is kind of true on both sides. It's true of the militiamen and the frontiersmen who didn't have families. And it's also true of the young warriors of the tribes. The young warriors are like, hey, let's just immediately kill them all. As soon as we have any issue, we're going to demand swift, violent raids, and we're going to just halt their progress. We're going to stop it dead in the tracks before it becomes irreversible. And then you have moderates, people who have been there for a while, who have had some trade with the whites. We just had the story in our last chapter of a guy who was tragically betrayed and who had been peaceful, and then his family's killed by a bad party. And then because of that, he becomes retaliatory as well. And so there's two camps. We would call it like the older, wiser Indians. They want strategic caution. The younger guys want warfare. Their argument on the moderate side is that they realize that if they attack the settlers are going to unite in turn, and it's going to be devastating because they'll just then be an all-out unwinnable war. What do you want to add to this, Titus?
There's a lot of dissension between the chiefs, and that actually plays, I think, to the benefit of the whites in some ways. There's raiding parties that go out. There's not exactly an entire consensus between all of the chiefs that we should go and attack. One tribe with some of the dissenters from another tribe will go on this raid, but with it being split into smaller factions of 30% from one tribe and 20% from another tribe, when losses get heavy amidst a single tribe, for that individual group of, say, 20 out of the 100 Indians, and they lose 7 guys, and they decide that's too many guys for us to lose on this attack, we're going home. They just leave. They're not a unified army or militia like the whites would have, where it's like, no, you're part of the army. You have to listen to the commander and stay here. So even though there's one or maybe two co-chiefs leading this raid, their numbers reduced, it spurs other people to leave, and now they don't have sufficient numbers. So there's a lot of times the whites are up against the fence and they're hanging on by a thread, and the Indians just go away. They might have continued to attack, but the Indians, they're like, we're going to cut our losses, we're going to go home. And that actually kind of ends up helping the settlers out.
There's a lot of strokes of fortune in favor where the whites, they are super vulnerable. They have way fewer guys than the Indians, but just because they have a few guys that are good shooters like Kenton that are picking some of the Indians off. Because what the settlers do is they clear the land between the forest and the fort so that they have this area that they can defend. Otherwise, the Indians could come right on their doorstep. And when the Indians do come on their doorstep and kill a settler that's out, chopping wood or gathering or whatever they do, then immediately the settlers, they raise the alarm and they run back in. So the Indians are trying to figure out how do they ambush and how do they raid. The nature of tribal raiding warfare, it's not organized, it's opportunistic. They don't have a cohesion on how to win. They're still trying to figure out how the whites handle business. They're very good at quickly pivoting, even with less numbers than the Indians. If the Indians had been united and they really had all just gone all out after them, they could easily have wiped out any number of these settlements and there would have been nothing that could have been done. But because they're not unified and because they don't really work for each other's interests, they're smaller groups with their own interests in mind, then they're going to be subject to domination. We're going to talk a little bit about Kenton here. He's growing increasingly annoyed and anxious. Simon Butler is the moniker that he's going under, but remember, he's a man on the run because he doesn't want to face the repercussions from he believes he killed a man. And then his tactical evolution is always getting better. And because he's constantly out on the frontier, encountering Indians, wild game, he's learning and he's adopting all these different skills, and he's creating his own improvements out of necessity, not just taking on the things of the Indians, but he's becoming formidable on his own and even more advanced than them in some ways. He makes improvements to his tomahawk. He adapts his close quarters combat style for the escalating violence. He's also a defender because he's foregoing isolation. His occupation at this point is to go and get meat for them, wild game for them. He becomes instrumental in protecting the vulnerable outposts, specifically because he knows how to get from one to the other. He knows how to navigate the land unlike anybody else. The particular areas that he's really good at is Hingson's and McClellan's settlements, at getting between those two lands and communicating with the people there. They trust him. And this is only going to cement his status, particularly as an elite sharpshooter. Not only is he good in close quarters combat, he's learned to pick off wild game. If he's in the proximity of people that are going to be attacked by the Indians, he's going to drop a few. So he's part of the reason that the Indians become afraid and back off their attacks in many instances.
Yeah, absolutely. We see Kenton becoming more and more formidable in the woods. The tracking aspect of tracking both game and humans is almost second nature to him. He sees things that no one else does. He's also adapted his dress to what works really well that he's learned from observing Indians. He's not wearing traditional Western fabrics. He's wearing buckskins, clothes made out of animal hides. He's wearing a coonskin cap. He's very tan. He basically looks, sounds, smells a lot like an Indian in how he moves through the woods. He's not wearing traditional shoes. He's wearing a moccasin style shoe, so that gives him a softer footfall. He picks his footfalls carefully so he's not breaking branches and disturbing the terrain as he walks through it. He has really, really further honed his skill with his rifle. His marksmanship, which was already renowned on the frontier, has gotten even better. Not just marksmanship from a settled position, taking aim at a standing deer that's standing still, but shooting while he's on the run from odd, awkward positions, crouching, jumping to the side, whirling around, and he's deadly accurate with it. He takes on many different names to the Indians, actually, but in the first stages of his story here, two different names they use for him. One, they call him the man whose gun is always loaded because of his ability to reload on the run, which is not a common skill at all.
Yeah, with the flintlock rifle, that's just an insane skill. The Last of the Mohicans, that movie's a really good depiction of being able to do that on the move, but very few people have that skill.
Because of this, the Indians kind of know this. They're used to coming in groups and one taking people by surprise, and so they try to fire off a shot, and now their weapon's unloaded and they probably didn't even hit anything. When the guy tries to get behind a tree and reload, they flank him, circle him, and they could pick him off. But that doesn't work with Kenton because when they initiate their surprise, usually it's not a surprise. And that takes us into a story here where Kenton, he's been renowned on the frontier, but he's never actually killed an Indian until in this chapter. He does kill. He's walking through the woods. He hears a twig snap, whirls around, and shoots him right between the eyes in a flash. And then he just hightails it. He doesn't look much. He sees that there's other Indians there, and he just runs. The Indians, they don't chase him because they recognize who it is that they tried to ambush, and they didn't actually get to enact their ambush because he sensed their presence. He heard just a slight rustling and a twig snap behind him, which seems like an innocuous sound to hear in the forest, but he recognized that is not normal and immediately was able to get the drop on an Indian who actively had a gun aimed at him, shoot the Indian who was about to shoot him, get away, and he reloads as he runs. And that takes us to his other name, which is the man who never misses. They knew him as two things. Like, one, he never misses. If you're going to go after him, you have to get the drop on him. And two, his gun is always loaded somehow. Even when he fires his gun, if he turns around again, his gun is loaded. So that's just his skill with the rifle. And as Cam mentioned, also gaining additional proficiency with the tomahawk and the knife. Kenton isn't known for being the most prolific user of a tomahawk in combat necessarily. He uses that more as a tool, but he is definitely proficient with it. And the Indians know this, as well as his knife and his hand-to-hand combat skills. And as he, touching on the defender part of this, he really enjoys helping people down the river. He enjoys kind of waiting out on the riverbank, keeping an eye on things. And when he sees settlers coming down the river, hails them. And a lot of them, to my point earlier about how he has adapted his way of living, his lifestyle, and his address to the frontier, a lot of them mistake him for an Indian at the beginning. He's got very tanned skin from being outside all the time. He's wearing Indian style clothing, and they assume, oh no, it's Indian. Kenton has bright red hair. He's got very red auburn hair. So that is something that is not on any Indian. Being a ginger saves him. So he'll whip his coonskin cap off, and they can see, oh, this Indian has red hair. They see that he has bright blue eyes, and they recognize, oh, this isn't an Indian. This is actually a white man. Then they get to meet the famous Simon Butler that they've heard so much about.
Well, and most of them weren't prepared to engage like he was. So that's why the Indians catch them unawares. So he catches them unawares, but then he quickly teaches them how to survive and hey, this is dangerous territory. Let me help you. Let me get you down the river. This is where you want to put in. He's named most of the parts on the river. He knows exactly where they're going to be in danger. And the other thing with the Indians is if they take a shot at the settlers that Simon's with or at him, they give away their position and he can immediately pick them out and he'll just fire back. Simon, we don't have a lot of depictions of him in this book fighting hand-to-hand with the tomahawk, would have certainly been able to do it. But because he was so proficient with the rifle, there is one particular scenario where he does whip out his tomahawk, and that's going to come in the next chapter, I believe. It's pretty amazing. It's my favorite part in the entire book. And he can reload so fast, and that's going to do more damage, and it's going to keep an opponent from getting close enough to you to do harm. Then he doesn't have to become so proficient at a tomahawk. He's mastered the rifle, and he can pick people off from a distance. Some really cool elements of his combat style.
The reputation that Kenton has. We want to be men as Christians who are capable men. We don't want to be bloodthirsty and seek violence, but when we are competent and capable of holding our own, of defending people, and it is known about us, we're not just fronting like we can fight. We can actually fight. We can go toe to toe and win. It actually prevents a lot of encounters that we would maybe get into a bad position in. You don't have to fight for your life if you don't get in the fight in the first place. And so his awareness of this and his reputation too really save him a lot of unnecessary skirmishes. People leave the people he's escorting down the river alone because they see he's there. Oh, they're with Kenton. We don't want to fight that guy. We'll find an easier boat full of settlers to attack and take their stuff. We'll kill them. Dad always said, don't be at stupid places during stupid hours with stupid people. And that's kind of Kenton's MO. He doesn't hang around with people who have proven themselves incompetent. If somebody has a harebrained plan and he tells them that's stupid and they say, we're going to do it anyway, he'll say, okay, well, I wish you the best of luck. Here's my advice, but I'm not coming with you. He really trusts his sentences and he's really honed that in. It saves him a lot of trouble.
We're going to find out that the other characters in the book who didn't turn from those wicked ways, they're going to face the consequences of that. They're living by the sword. They're going to die by the sword. Kenton's not living by the sword. He's using his rifle as a tool primarily to provide food for other people. and then it's a defensive tool next to that. She shoots reluctantly, but he shoots accurately. He reminds me a lot of Richard the Lionheart. Also had red hair, and the Muslims did not want to engage him in battle because, first of all, he was deadly with a crossbow. He like even when he was sick. There's an amazing depiction in I think it's Defenders of the West where he sat on his bed because he was super sick, and he was firing his crossbow. So he obviously had guys reloading him, but he was so accurate with it. He was like sick, but picking off Muslims from the walls, and they can't stand him because he's so good. And the crossbow was way more deadly than just a regular bow was, which is what the Muslims had. And then even to a point later on where he jumps off of his ship with nothing but he's basically just got a tunic, a shield, and a sword, and comes to shore against all kinds of guys who are mounted cavalry, a bunch of soldiers, and they just basically flee before him. And those that don't die immediately, and he would have been considered vulnerable, but because he was so formidable and they knew who this guy was, they didn't want to engage him in hand-to-hand combat. And he ends up getting on the beach before anybody else, and then his men follow, and eventually they go back and they take this really important port city that had been retaken by the Muslims, and it's Jaffa. Simon Kenton's kind of like a Richard the Lionheart of this time in American history, which is really cool. And the note of them both having red hair and both being massive hulking men is really important. Also on that note, Titus, that reminds me of a recent Warrior Poet video that I watched where John Lovell was talking about situational awareness. You know, it's like we all focus on our gear and our weapons and what's your EDC, and he's like, man, honestly, like if you could shoot well, that's really important. But situational awareness is the most important thing because it's keeping away from a fight. We just did a course to get our Idaho enhanced license this last weekend, me and 9 other guys from our church security team. 80% of the class was situational awareness. What are going to be the legal ramifications of this? How do you assess a threat? What type of force can you use? When can you use it? What are the laws in Idaho? What are the laws in Washington? And then we had a law enforcement officer come in and talk about all this stuff. And the guy who taught our class has shot 1.8 million rounds in his lifetime. He's an incredible marksman, and he's actually a really heavy set dude. But he gave us so many stories about how he operates and how he thinks and his family and everything to where you're like, I would want to be at the same restaurant as this guy. I'd want to be in this guy's neighborhood because he's so situationally aware that but you could have prevented many deaths simply through your situational awareness. And there was actually a story that he told us. They drove way up into the North Country. There was an ambush on the road. There was a car that was parked in the middle of the road, and there was a group that was going to carjack him and his family. And he had his grandkids in the car. He went to pick up his daughter and son-in-law who were kind of stranded out there in the wilderness at one of these lakes. There's no cell service. There's nothing. And he stopped once he saw the car way ahead. A little girl approached the car, came up, put her hands on the car immediately. His wife had rolled down the window, which was not a smart idea, but he was already situationally aware enough to know what was going on. He could start to pick out other people, and realizing that they were in danger, he had his firearm out to where he could draw it almost immediately, or maybe he had drawn it and it was just at his side. And the girl who got close to the car saw it and yelled, "He's got a gun!" And all of the would-be carjackers scattered. So because of that, he was able to back up and get out of there and get out of harm's way and leave the situation. But I've never had a situation where I actually had to draw my gun out and shoot somebody. But if something was to go down at a football game that I was at down in Idaho or here locally, then I know exactly what to do in that situation. And he would make that situation safer. And there's a lot of people like that carrying in states like Idaho and in Ohio. And that's why it's so important to have guys that are not just armed, but that are armed with knowledge and situational awareness and know how to read and know how to use their weapon.
One key thing is the Battle of Lexington has happened. This is no longer colonies of Great Britain. These are what would become 13 states that are fighting for their independence. So the government structure shifts drastically. And with all the hot fighting in the Eastern Front there, United States government isn't going to help us.
You have the scattered vulnerability of the settlers, and then you have the unified militia network with the key figure being George Rogers Clark, who brings the structured military organization.
Under the leadership of George Rogers Clark, they create a colonial militia. And this is not just some rabble of farmers who happen to have rifles. What George really brings to the table here is his leadership ability, having been a militia commander. He's a surveyor by trade, but he is very competent and capable to lead men and to command men. He's taken an interest in politics and in the setting up of the rules and the laws that govern how things operate on the frontier, something that people like Kenton have not done. And he's very instrumental in helping make sure that those guys don't get more of a rough shake than they do in some ways. But he insists on having a disciplined militia, people who know their duty, are trained, and know what to do. And this banding together is really what separates them from the Indians. Even with fewer numbers, they're able to take on a superior force who knows the terrain probably better than they do and outnumbers them, but they have the discipline. And he heads up the construction of forts, or not even really forts, but what they would call blockhouses. There'd be a large central structure to any sort of a encampment, town, village. Think log cabin, but very thick, built up, no windows, one door, very fortified, and little loopholes through the walls so that they can poke a rifle out and they can shoot out of these loopholes while they can remain protected from incoming fire. Now, they were susceptible to being set on fire, but like Cameron mentioned, with the ground cleared around them, it would have been a withering hail of gunfire to get close enough for the Indians to try to set it on fire. And they had countermeasures such as pre-stocking buckets of water inside so that they could dump them on any fires the Indians had tried to start on different occasions. So that's how Clark fits into this whole picture here.
So the last chapter, Dunmore's British regular forces were fighting with the militia and they were unwilling partners against the Indians. But now that the British have lost the war, they immediately go on the side of the Indians. British allies and the Shawnees are taking up with each other because the colonial militia is such a force to be reckoned with, which is, a testament to the early Americans who fought and won the war. And it's not like everything was done and was easy after we won the war for independence. Okay, the first 13 colonies around, we did our Declaration of Independence. That's kind of how your American history typically is understood. Skip from that to the Civil War. We do have the War of 1812, but that's just one small portion of the 40-year frontier war. Even after the Civil War, we have war with the Indians continuing on all the way out west. I mean, Clark is my second favorite character in the book because without his organizational skills, combined with Simon's frontiersman skills, the settlers would not have survived. They would have all been picked off and murdered, and the Indians would have united and then grown their population and kept that land. So George Rogers Clark is a militiaman who also becomes a frontiersman out of necessity in the same way that Simon Kenton goes from being a tobacco farm kid into the frontiersman that he is.
Yeah, and this is just a testament too to the American spirit of betting on yourself. These guys truly were Americans in that sense. A lot of these people, it wasn't like they were just trying this frontier thing and they were going to go back home if it failed. They had sold everything. They moved out here. This was their life. So they weren't just running for the hills when the Indians came swooping out of the woods. This was their home. This was their house, their land, their fields, their cattle, their family. This is their family home now. They don't have another option. They rallied around a leader like Clark, who was able to provide them structure and leadership that would enable them to actually keep their homes and to not just be completely destitute or worse.
Great point. The American spirit. Without that, if they had been weak-willed and easily scared off, that would have only emboldened the Indians. But because that's not how Americans are built, they're built different. Then they not only defeated, they cast off the British yoke, but then they're going to immediately confront this Indian Confederacy with greater strength. The synthesis is we have now the death of the lone frontiersman, what we've been harping on throughout this and in other instances it be regenerated as the lone ranger, the lone frontiersman, or I often call it, in our day and age, the lone guru on the nutrition front. This is a dying breed out of necessity. They're not going to be able to survive. So the core insight in this chapter, it's this definitive end to his solitary lone wolf, a stage of life into knowingly and organizationally part of something bigger. So the survival on the frontier is no longer defined by battling the elements and tracking game or solitary endurance. That was a necessary crucible that he went through. And now he's in this new reality where his existence requires navigation, these different geopolitical alliances on both sides. But you essentially have three different sides. You've got the British, the Indians, and all of their different tribes. And then you've also got the frontiersmen and the settlers. So he's defending against organized military raids and participating in the relentless collective struggle for the American continent. And there's something else that you had mentioned earlier on, Titus, along those lines. Not just the death of the lone frontiersman, but how the Indians actually treated each other. Because there's an instance in this chapter where one group of Indians sells the land to the settlers, and it wasn't their land to sell.
To back up a little bit, there's a character by the name of Judge Henderson, and this is prior to the Declaration of Independence, War for Independence, any of that happening. But he sees this new frontier as land for the taking. He sees the Indians. He's like, oh, they're probably simple-minded. I can buy things cheaply from them. And so he creates the Transylvania Land Company.
Was he from that part of Europe or something? Maybe they found vampires. Shout out to Honey Cosmos.
his goal really with this is to create his own country. Really, he feels the rumblings of independence, and it's like, you know what, the British are way east. If I just own this land here, I can set myself up as king over this little kingdom and do what I want, basically. And that's all well and good, except the Cherokee Indians were very happy to sell him this land because they didn't own it. So he talks to these Cherokees, and this kind of goes to what we talked about last week with the Indians and their treaties and their lack of honesty in their treaties and a little bit of the duplicity that happens there. They sell him land that they don't own, but it's just land that they use in treaty with the Shawnee. And the Shawnee, this guy, he's not necessarily a frontiersman, he's a judge. So he's kind of in this area to act as a judge for disputes between the white settlers and things. And he has his own side ambitions, this land company. And with that, he's not thinking about the fact that all the Indians aren't one people. So he talks to the Cherokee Indians, and they have bad blood with the Shawnee. That's why this land is used in treaty. It's saying, don't kill us if we use this land, because we generally have bad blood between each other. We don't like each other that much. So they're like, well, cool. He thinks we own this land. It was thousands of dollars or pounds at the time worth of ammunition and other different things and rifles that he gives them in exchange for this land, claiming this land. Hey, I have this land. And his plan is to sell parts of the land off to people and make a fortune with this land company. I own all this land. You can come buy land from me. And he's going to make 100 times his money back and be king of this small empire.
What would they have wanted those rifles for? To dominate the other tribes. They're buying them from the whites so that they can go into another land and fight somebody else, either whites or Indians. So it's very devious.
Exactly. So in a way, he kind of arms this whole war against the settlers, whether knowingly or unknowingly. He wasn't an idiot. He had to have known that these rifles would be used against settlers at one point or another. But the real crux of this issue is, one, I wanted to bring this up because he will come into play with some other legal rulings and things that happen that do involve Kenton and other frontiersmen and their claims to land later on down the road, and how the U.S. government deals with him and others like him, but also because of this conflict of interest with the Cherokees and the Shawnee and the land being sold that wasn't even owned by the Cherokee.
To summarize all this, nothing is new under the sun. As you become proficient in reading stories and diving deep into stories, and the reason that this one is so important to us is because it's the American story. Again, Titus lives in this region. I have my grandfather on my mother's side goes back to Kentucky, settling that land early on. This is part of who we are as heritage Americans, and knowing what it took for people to conquer this land is really important. And knowing that it wasn't stolen, it was genuinely conquered. In some instances, it was bought and it was traded. If you're an American, we hope that you're really enjoying this, but we're going to continue beating Simon Kenton's path and talking about the battles and the development of the militia against the Indian Confederacy in our next chapter. Thanks for listening to The Frontiersmen. I'm Cameron. This is Titus, and we'll see you again.